The hall was hushed, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and thick. It was the final round of the city's most respected music competition. The air smelled of old wood from the polished stage and the faint sweetness of the flowers placed near the judge's table. On the chairs sat the best musicians from the region, teenagers with serious faces. A few young adults clutching their instruments. All of them winners of smaller contests to get here. The head judge, a man with kind eyes but a stern demeanor, stood up. He explained the final test. It was not a famous sonata or a well-known concerto. Instead, it was something new, a piece published just that year. He held up the sheet music. "This," he said, his voice echoing slightly, "is called The Whirlwind. It was written by a composer known for challenging the performer. We have chosen it to see not just who can play the notes, but who can solve the puzzle." A low whisper went through the crowd. This was unusual. The sheet music was passed to the first contestant, a tall boy with a violin. He looked at it, his face pale under the bright stage lights. He began to play. The music that came out was jagged and full of strange leaps. It sounded like a storm trying to form. After just a minute, his bow slipped, creating a horrible screech. He stopped, mumbled an apology, and walked off the stage with his head down. Next was a young woman at the grand piano. She took a deep breath before placing her fingers on the keys. She played faster, attacking the complicated runs of notes with determination. But the piece was tricky. One hand was doing something in a rapid 7 beats, while the other was in a smooth 4. It was like trying to rub your stomach and pat your head at 2 completely different speeds. Her rhythm broke apart. She tried to restart, her fingers fumbling, but the melody was lost. With a look of deep frustration, she let her hands fall into her lap. This pattern continued. A clarinetist got lost in a series of dizzyingly fast notes. A cellist struggled with chords that demanded fingers stretch into uncomfortable, unfamiliar shapes. Each performer, who had played beautiful classical pieces perfectly just an hour before, was brought to a stop by the whirlwind. The audience shifted in their seats. They weren't bored. They were witnessing a kind of public mystery. Was this piece simply too hard? Then, something even more surprising happened. After the last official contestant gave up, the head judge did something unexpected. He turned to his fellow judges, 2 women and another man, all respected teachers and performers. "Perhaps we should demonstrate the difficulty," he said with a small, wry smile. "Shall we try?" One of the judges, a famous piano teacher known for her sharp ear, agreed. She sat at the piano, put on her glasses, and studied the music for a full minute. She began to play, and for a few seconds, it was magnificent. She understood the music's soul, but then she reached a section where the left hand had to jump wildly from very low notes to the middle of the keyboard in a split second. Her hand missed its mark. The chord came out wrong. She laughed, a genuine, unbothered laugh, and waved her hand in surrender. "No, no," she said to the audience. "You see? It's a beast. This would take me weeks of slow, careful practice. To play it cold? Nearly impossible." The other judges nodded in agreement. The head judge addressed the crowd. "You have seen the highest level of skill our city has to offer today, and you have seen them meet a challenge that for now remains undefeated. This is not a failure. This is a reminder that music is a lifelong journey, and some mountains are meant to be climbed slowly." A sense of finality settled in the room. The competition was effectively over. There would be no winner of the final round. Parents began to gather their coats. The defeated contestants were talking softly, consoling each other. It was a respectful but deeply unsatisfying end. The mountain, as the judge called it, remained unclimbed, but in the third row, A little boy had been watching everything with big, curious eyes. He had come with his older sister, who had played a lovely, simple melody on her flute earlier, but hadn't made it to this final round. While the drama unfolded, he had been mostly quiet, drawing pictures of spaceships and dragons in a notepad. He didn't really understand the tension. He just heard the music. He heard the crashes and the stops. And when the piano teacher judge played that small part, his head tilted. To the others, it was a mistake. To him, it was just a different sound than what was on the page. He looked at the sheet music still sitting on the piano, a complex mess of black dots and lines from where he was sitting. He didn't feel fear looking at it. He just felt a question forming in his mind. Asterisk, what if the notes wanted to be friends, and everyone was just being too rough with them? Asterisk, he wasn't thinking about winning or losing. He wasn't thinking about impressing the judges. A simple, childlike thought floated into his head. I want to hear how the story ends. The piece was called The Whirlwind, and everyone had stopped in the middle of the storm. He wondered what calm sounded like after it. Without really thinking about the scale of what he was doing, absorbed only by his own curiosity, he raised his small hand in the air. The little boy's hand, small and slightly tentative, went up in the quiet rustle of the dispersing crowd. For a moment, no one noticed. His mother, sitting beside him, was busy putting a colored pencil back into a case. She looked over, and her eyes went wide. She gently but firmly took his wrist and tried to pull it down, whispering urgently into his ear. What are you doing? No, sweetheart, no. That's for the big contestants. The competition is over. But the boy, his gaze fixed on the grand piano that shone under the lights, didn't lower his hand. He wasn't being stubborn. He just hadn't finished his thought. The judges were still at their table, talking in low voices, looking a bit disappointed by the whole affair. The head judge happened to glance out at the audience, perhaps to see how many people were left. He saw the small, persistent hand in the third row. A smile touched his lips. It had been a long, tense afternoon. Here was something unexpectedly simple. He thought he understood. A young child, probably inspired by his big sister who had performed earlier, wanted a moment at the big piano. A cute distraction. Perhaps it would lighten the mood, give everyone a gentle, happy moment to end on. He leaned into his microphone, its click echoing. Well, well, he said, his voice warm and amused. It seems we have one more volunteer. Come on up, young man. A light chuckle rippled through the remaining audience. People paused in putting on their coats. They turned to look. They saw a little boy, probably 7 or 8, in a slightly too formal shirt. His mother, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and worry, whispered to him fiercely. But the boy, with a calmness that seemed unusual, just slid off his seat and started walking toward the side stairs that led to the stage dot. His journey to the piano felt long. His shoes made soft, shuffling sounds on the polished wood floor. Everyone watched him. The older contestants, who had faced the brutal piece, looked on with gentle pity. They knew what was about to happen. They imagined him pecking out chopsticks, or maybe the first few bars of Twinkle. Twinkle, little star. It would be adorable. A little sad, but a nice palate cleanser after the intense failures. The boy reached the stairs. They were a bit high for him. He had to use his hands to help pull himself up onto the stage. The head judge walked over and kindly guided him toward the giant black grand piano. It loomed over the child like a sleeping beast. And what's your name, son? The judge asked. Bending down, the boy told him, his voice quiet but clear. The judge nodded. And did you enjoy the music today? The boy nodded. I liked the shiny flute, he said, referring to his sister. But the storm piece is loud. The judge chuckled again. The audience smiled. How cute, they thought. He calls it the storm piece. And would you like to play something for us? The judge asked, playing along with the moment. Do you know a song? The boy looked past the judge, at the sheet music still sitting on the piano's music desk. It was a chaotic forest of black notes, crazy symbols, and scribbled instructions. The judge followed his gaze. Oh, no, the judge said kindly, patting the boy's shoulder. That one is much too hard. It's for grown-ups. Do you know Happy Birthday? But the boy was already walking toward the piano bench. He didn't answer. He had a single-minded focus now. He wasn't listening to the judge or the soft, expectant laughter of the crowd. He was looking at the music. To everyone else, it was a complex code. To him, it was just a picture of the sounds he had heard people try to make and fail. He wanted to see the whole picture. He pushed the heavy bench back a little. It was meant for adults, and even pushed back, his feet would dangle well above the pedals. He climbed up and sat, his small frame almost disappearing behind the broad, curved side of the piano. The head judge stepped back, his hands raised in a "What dash can dash you dash do?" gesture to the audience. He decided to let the moment play out. The child would plink a few keys, everyone would applaud kindly, and then they could all go home. It was fine. The boy sat very still. He looked at the first page of The Whirlwind. His eyes moved across the lines, not left to right like reading a book, but in little jumps and circles. He wasn't reading every note one by one. It would have taken an hour. It was as if he was taking a photograph of it with his mind, seeing the shapes of the phrases, the clusters of notes, like clouds on the page. His mother in the third row had her hand over her mouth. She was torn between stopping this before it became a spectacle and seeing what her quiet, strangely focused son would do. He had always had a weird way with music. He could hear a song from a cartoon once and find its basic chords on the old keyboard at home. But this was impossible. This was a very public mistake about to happen. The boy reached out his hands. They were small, with short fingers. How could those hands possibly span the wide chords the piece demanded? He placed them lightly on the cool, smooth ivory of the keys. He took a deep breath, his small shoulders rising and falling. The hall became utterly silent. The earlier silence had been tense. This one was different. It was the silence of people holding back, of adults bracing themselves for a charming, harmless failure. They were ready to smile with pity. The boy closed his eyes for a second. He wasn't trying to remember the notes. He was trying to remember the feelings the notes on the page had given him when the others played. The frustration, the storm, the sudden stops. In his mind, it wasn't a puzzle. It was a story that had been left unfinished. He opened his eyes, looked at the first measure, and let his fingers fall. The first sound that came from the piano was a single, clear note. It hung in the quiet air of the hall, pure and simple. It wasn't what anyone expected. They expected a clumsy child's press, a jumble, maybe the beginning of a nursery rhyme, but it was just that one note. The boy looked at his finger, then back at the page. He had pressed the wrong key. A tiny, almost invisible frown appeared on his face. In the audience, his mother closed her eyes for a second. The head judge gave a gentle, understanding nod. It was starting. The child had gotten lost before he'd even begun, but the boy didn't look embarrassed. He didn't scramble or freeze. He just tilted his head, as if listening to the echo of that wrong note fade away. He looked from the key he had pressed to the one on the sheet music. It was like he was solving a tiny, personal problem. This one, he thought, not that one. He moved his finger one key to the left. Then he began. This time, it was different. His left hand pressed a low, rumbling chord. It was the correct chord. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it had a certain weight to it, a dark color. Before the sound had even faded, his right hand danced up the keyboard, a quick, light run of notes that sounded like the first few drops of rain hitting a window. The audience didn't move. The judges slowly stopped smiling. This wasn't Happy Birthday. The boy's face was a picture of complete concentration. His brow was slightly furrowed, but his mouth was relaxed. He wasn't struggling. He was watching his own hands as they moved, as if he was just a passenger seeing where they would go next. The piece, The Whirlwind, started slow. It was a gathering storm. The left hand played a restless, pacing rhythm, while the right hand sketched out a melody that was nervous, full of jumps and pauses. And the boy played it. Not perfectly, not yet. His timing in one spot was a little loose, like he was thinking about it. One of the chords was slightly uneven, because his small hand had to stretch awkwardly. But he didn't stop. He flowed right past the imperfection. The most astonishing thing was that he was playing the actual, correct notes of that monstrously difficult piece. He wasn't making up his own song. He was reading the storm from the page. The head judge leaned forward, his elbows on the table. He wasn't a kind man humoring a child anymore. He was a musician witnessing something he could not explain. He looked at the other judges. The piano teacher had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide. She was following the sheet music in her mind, and this little boy on stage was matching it. The boy reached the end of the first page. This was where the first violinist had faltered. The music changed. The left hand's pacing rhythm broke into a wilder, more complicated pattern. The boy's left hand jumped down to the deep, growling bass notes. His legs, dangling high above the pedals, swung slightly with the effort. He hit the notes cleanly. Then came the first of the crazy runs, a cascade of notes tumbling down the keyboard, like water over rocks. This was where the older girl at the piano had lost control, where the rhythm had split apart. The audience held its breath. The boy's right hand flew up, poised, and then swept down the keys. It wasn't just fast. It was clear. Every single note in that blurry run rang out distinct and bright. Ting, 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 ting. It was like a string of perfect pearls falling onto a glass table. A soft, collective gasp went through the hall. It was involuntary, the sound of shock being let out. The boy didn't hear it. His world had shrunk to the size of the piano keys and the story in the music. He was in the whirlwind now. His body moved with it. He leaned into the loud, crashing chords, his small frame rocking forward. He pulled back during the quiet, sneaky passages, his face coming closer to the keys as if listening to a secret. He played through the section that had defeated the piano teacher judge, the huge leap for the left hand. He didn't even seem to see it as a leap. His hand, so small, simply flew from the deep note to the middle of the keyboard and landed, soft and precise, on the next chord. It wasn't an athletic struggle. It was a natural movement, like a bird hopping from one branch to another. The piano teacher judge let out a small, choked sound. The music was no longer just notes being played correctly. Something else was happening. The boy was starting to feel it. During a slow, aching middle section, where the melody became sad and lonely, his playing softened. The notes connected to each other, singing a little song within the storm. A woman in the audience felt tears prick her eyes, and she didn't know why. It was just a child playing, but he was somehow telling her the story of the lonely part of the storm. He wasn't technically perfect. A few times, a note was quieter than it should have been, because his finger didn't have the strength. Once, he used the wrong finger for a turn, creating a slightly different texture. But these weren't mistakes. They were choices, adaptations. His body was doing what it could to translate the map on the page into sound. And he never, ever stopped. The flow was continuous, relentless, and alive. The hall was utterly captivated. No one coughed. No one whispered. They were seeing a miracle unfold in real time. This small child, who had to pull himself onto the stage, was taming the beast that had beaten everyone else. He wasn't fighting the piano. He seemed to be friends with it, asking it to help him tell this loud, complicated story. And the piano, under his small, sure hands, was singing for him. The music was building, climbing higher and higher. The little boy's hands were a blur now, but his face was calm, almost serene. It was as if the storm was raging in the music, but he was in the quiet, calm eye of it. He wasn't battling the piano anymore. He was riding the whirlwind, letting it carry him along. He reached the part that everyone in the hall now recognized as the impossible section. This was where the time signatures twisted, where one hand played in a rushing 7 beats while the other had to march steadily in 4. The adult contestants had described it later as trying to think 2 different math problems at the same time. The sheet music for this part looked like a tangled knot dot. The boy's left hand came down, establishing a deep, pulsing rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It was solid, like a heartbeat. Then, a split second later, his right hand entered. It flew across the keys in a glittering, uneven cascade. Asterisk 1-2-3-4-5-6-7. 1-2-3-4-5-6-7. It was a completely different rhythm, a different feeling, and he played them both, together, perfectly. The head judge's mouth fell open. He wasn't just surprised. He was witnessing a physical impossibility. This wasn't about practice. This was about how the boy's brain was wired. The 2 conflicting rhythms weren't separate to him. They were one complex, interlocking pattern. His hands weren't fighting each other. They were having a conversation. The left hand said, "I am the ground." The right hand replied, "I am the lightning in the sky." And they fit together. A man in the front row, a music professor from the local college, slowly took off his glasses and cleaned them as if he couldn't trust what he was seeing. He put them back on, staring intently at the boy's hands. They were so small, yet they were performing a feat of coordination that would make a seasoned professional sweat. The music began its final climb. This was the composer's grand, furious finale, a last blast of the storm before it passed. It demanded power. It demanded fury. The boy, for the first time, seemed to physically grow. He sat up straighter on the bench. He leaned his whole body into the keys. His small arms, with a strength no one knew he had, hammered out the massive, crashing chords. The sound wasn't just loud. It was rich and full. The grand piano, which had dwarfed him, now seemed to vibrate with his energy. His mother in the third row had tears streaming silently down her face. She wasn't crying from pride, not yet. She was crying from sheer disbelief. This was her son, the quiet boy who loved his cartoon music and his crayons, the boy who sometimes hummed complicated tunes he heard only once. She had thought it was a cute quirk. She never, in a million years, imagined this. She saw not a child, but a channel for something beautiful and ancient. It was overwhelming. On stage, the boy was lost to the world. A lock of his hair fell across his forehead, damp with effort. His cheeks were flushed. He was breathing in time with the phrases. The final run was coming, a series of notes, so fast they were just a sonic smear on the page, a last desperate spiral of the whirlwind. Every other contestant had stumbled here, their fingers tripping over themselves in the speed. The boy took a sharp, deep breath. He coiled his hands over the keys. And then he let go. His right hand became a streak of motion. The notes were not individual hits anymore. They were a continuous shimmering ribbon of sound, shooting from the top of the piano all the way down to the bottom. It was flawless. It was effortless. It was the sound of the storm finally, joyously, exhausting itself. And then, the final two chords. The first was a huge, dissonant crash. All the tension and conflict of the piece gathered into one fist of sound. The boy threw his hands at the keyboard for it, his whole body behind the movement. The chord echoed through the hall, harsh and magnificent. There was a single breathless second of silence. The storm had spent its last bit of rage. The boy's hands, now gentle, floated to the very top of the keyboard. He played the last chord. It was a single, high, ringing cluster of notes. It was not a major chord, happy and sweet. It was something more complex, a chord that held both sadness and peace, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a terrible storm, glittering on the wet ground. He held the pedal down with a foot that just barely reached, letting that final, beautiful, complicated sound shimmer in the absolute quiet. He lifted his hands. He placed them softly in his lap. He was done. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound at all. The audience was paralyzed. They had just been on a journey, and they had forgotten where they were. They had forgotten he was a child. They had forgotten it was a competition. They had only heard the story of the whirlwind, told from beginning to end for the first time. The boy blinked. He looked out at the sea of silent, staring faces. The intense focus that had held him together suddenly vanished. He looked small again, and a little unsure. He turned on the bench and looked for his mother. His expression asked a simple, quiet question. Asterisk, was that okay? Asterisk, that's when the sound began. It started with the piano teacher, Judge. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly behind her. She wasn't clapping. She was just standing, her hands clasped in front of her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Then the head judge stood. Then the other judge. Then, like a wave, every single person in the hall erupted from their seats. The sound wasn't just applause. It was a roar. It was shouts and cheers and cries of bravo. It was the thunderous, deafening release of awe that had been building for 3 straight minutes. People were not just clapping for a performance. They were applauding a mystery, a miracle they knew they would tell their friends about for years. I was there, they would say. I saw it with my own eyes. The roar of the crowd washed over the little boy like a physical wave. He flinched, his eyes growing wider. He hadn't expected this. He had just wanted to hear how the story ended. Now, hundreds of people were on their feet, their faces blurry through the bright stage lights, their hands crashing together in a sound like endless rain. He looked down at his own hands in his lap, as if checking they were still his. The head judge was the first to move toward him. He wasn't walking with his usual official stride. He almost stumbled in his hurry, his eyes red. He crouched down next to the piano bench, putting himself at the boy's level. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, and he had to speak loudly to be heard over the din. How? Was the only word he could manage at first. He shook his head, trying to form a better question. Young man, how did you do that? The boy just looked at him. The question didn't make sense to him. He hadn't done anything. He had just played the song. He shrugged his small shoulders. It was on the paper, he said simply, pointing to the sheet music dot. The piano teacher Judge joined him, wiping her cheeks with her fingers. But you'd never seen it before today? She asked, her voice gentle but full of wonder. The boy shook his head. No, but I listened when they tried. He meant the older contestants. It sounded stuck, so I just played where it wanted to go next. The judges looked at each other. They were trained to understand years of practice, of technique, of theory. This was something else entirely. This was pure, instinctive music. The boy didn't see barriers or difficulties. He saw a path, and he walked it. By now, the boy's mother had made her way to the edge of the stage. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, but she was smiling a wobbly, disbelieving smile. The head judge saw her and helped the boy down from the bench. The moment the boy's feet touched the floor, he scurried over to his mother and buried his face in her coat. The overwhelming noise and attention were too much. He just wanted to hide now. The head judge took the microphone. The crowd slowly began to settle, but the energy in the room was electric, buzzing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice cracking. He paused, collecting himself. "I have been judging music for 25 years. I have heard brilliance. I have heard hard work rewarded. Tonight I heard a small miracle." He looked over at the boy, who was peeking out from his mother's side. "We came here for a competition. We set a challenge to find a winner. But I think the music itself found its voice instead. It was waiting for the right listener." He walked over to the trophy table. There was a large, shining cup for the winner of the final round. He picked it up and turned back. But then he stopped. He looked at the trophy, then at the little boy, who was clearly overwhelmed. Presenting him with a big winner's cup felt suddenly wrong. It would make this moment about competition, about beating others. And that wasn't what this was about at all. He put the trophy down. Instead, he walked to the piano and carefully picked up the sheet music for the whirlwind. He came back to the center of the stage, knelt down again, and offered it to the boy. "Would you accept this?" The judge asked softly. "As a thank you. A thank you for reminding all of us what music really is. It's not just the notes on the page. It's the story. And you were the only one who could tell it tonight." The boy, encouraged by his mother's gentle nudge, let go of her coat and took the offered sheets. He held the complicated music in his small hands. He looked at it, not as a challenge, but as a gift. He gave a small, shy nod. "That's all I wanted," the boy whispered, but the microphone picked it up. A soft, warm laugh floated through the audience. The event ended not with formal prizes or announcements, but with a slow, buzzing dissipation. People didn't want to leave. They clustered in small groups, talking excitedly, replaying what they had seen. The older contestants, the ones who had struggled with the piece, were not jealous. They were in awe. One of the teenage girls who had played earlier went up to the boy and his mother. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she said sincerely. "You made me hear the song inside the notes." The boy just smiled shyly and held his mother's hand tighter as they walked out of the hall into the cool evening air. The world felt different. The mother looked down at her son, who was now happily swinging the rolled-up sheet music like a sword. The intense, powerful artist was gone. He was just her little boy again, tired and ready for bed. "Sweetheart," she asked quietly as they walked to the car, "when you were up there, what were you thinking about?" He thought for a second, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the dark blue sky. "I was thinking about the storm," he said, "and then about the quiet after. I just played until it got quiet." She stopped and hugged him tightly. That simple explanation holding more truth than any expert analysis ever could dot back in the now empty hall. The caretaker was turning off the lights. He paused by the stage, looking at the grand piano. He had heard the whole thing from the back. He wasn't a musician. He just liked a nice tune. But what that kid had done, it had given him chills. He shook his head, a smile on his face, and switched off the last light. The stage was dark, the piano just a silent shadow. But the air in the room seemed to still hum, holding on to the echoes of a storm that had been finally, flawlessly understood, not by a champion, but by a child who simply listened.